So when I was growing up, I was part of this church. A lot of good things about it, but also some bad things about it. It was pretty, I would call it pretty judgy, pretty regressive about things like women and gay people, that kind of stuff. And in a lot of ways, it was bad for me because of how I didn't fit into the way they thought people ought to be. So I left, and later I was talking to someone else who went to that church and saying, hey, these are all ways that I think this was bad for me. And this person was like, well, I'm having a hard time believing you because you're so upset about it. It's kind of like, huh, that's odd. Like, it seems like something I should be upset about. I don't see why having emotions disqualifies what I have to say about these uh, moral assessments I'm making of this church. And that's the kind of thing Mary Midgley is concerned with in the reading. It comes from a book she wrote about animals and why they matter to morality. So the focus of the book is on vegetarianism, animal testing, things like that. But I think you can kind of see it has wider application, right? So she's interested in the ways that debates about vegetarianism or animal cruelty or whatever, they tend to get caught up in these kind of debates about emotions and like, oh, well, you're just overreacting, you're being emotional, you're not thinking clearly. So she presents two extremes about the place of emotion in making moral judgments and the place of emotion in moral discussions. Right? There's emotivism. Emotivism is a philosophical theory that moral statements are nothing but expressions of emotions or feelings or desires. So if I say stealing is wrong, it might sound like I'm making a statement like the bookshelf is full or the door has a doorknob on it. But actually, I'm not making a statement of any kind of fact. I'm just expressing my feelings, right? So if I say stealing is wrong, all I'm actually doing, says the emotivist, is I'm going, stealing, you know. So sometimes it's called the boo hiss theory of morality, because you can sort of think of it as saying, if you make a statement about morality, you're actually just kind of going, boo, stealing, you know. So that's one extreme, according to Mary Midgley, is you just boil down moral statements to this kind of expression of feeling. And then the other she calls rationalism. Rationalism means a lot of things in philosophy, but what she means by it is this idea that emotions just don't have a place in moral beliefs or moral discussions at all, that they're just a distraction. They keep you from thinking clearly. They're inappropriate. It's kind of like a faux pas to introduce them into what ought to be this rational discussion of moral facts. So you can think about that with sort of the examples I opened with. You know, my friend who kind of dismissed me because I was too emotional about the church. That would be kind of like a rationalist position, right? Like, oh, you're just acting out of emotions. You're confused right now. This is not the kind of thing that you bring up when discussing the moral facts, right? That's rationalism. On the other hand, you might have someone who's kind of like, you know, if you were talking to someone and they were like, no, I just don't think gay people should raise kids. You might be like, well, I mean, there's all these studies that suggest it's just as good for kids as, you know, a heterosexual couple raising them, all else being equal. And they might just be like, well, never mind the facts and the research. My emotions are what determine my moral beliefs, and you can't tell me what to think because it's just my feelings, right? It's kind of like back off, since you can't control my feelings, we can't have a rational discussion about emotions, right? That'd be kind of an extreme version of an emotivist position. So those are the two extremes that she's addressing in this chapter, right? Emotivism, these moral beliefs, they don't have rational content. They're just expressions of feeling. Or you could be a rationalist and think, well, emotions just have no place in moral statements, moral discussions. They're a distraction from rational considerations that matter more. And she has arguments why she thinks these are too extreme. They mostly have to do with the process of moral disagreement, moral debate. She thinks we do that all the time. She thinks we have to do that all the time. And if it's something we always do and that we have to do and that we can do right, then that can show us that both of these positions are too extreme, right? If you're an emotivist, you don't really believe you can argue about moral facts. You can try to change how people feel about things, by making them feel something else. But you can't present considerations that make a difference to moral statements and moral debates, right? So like, if you were an emotivist, you wouldn't really think that it makes sense to say, I disagree with somebody who thinks that gay people shouldn't raise kids, for example, or that stealing is always fine, right? If you talk to someone who thinks stealing is fine all the time, no matter what, you might think you're disagreeing with them. The emotivist is going to say, well, you can't be disagreeing with them. You just feel different things, That'd be like saying someone who's happy and someone who's sad for no reason are disagreeing, right? But that doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem like moral disagreements are fake. It seems like we really disagree about what the right thing to do is. But if we really disagree about what the right thing to do is, then it's not just feelings that we're talking about. There's something else going on, right? So emotivism's got to be too extreme because we can disagree about morality. And if we can disagree about morality, that means we're not just gushing forth feelings. It means we're talking about something we can disagree about. What about rationalism? Well, again, she just points out what we actually do and what we actually think is right. So that's why she has this example of Troy, right? If the Greeks were about to take over Troy, with the Trojan horse, they're about to smuggle their guys in through this horse. If you know about that, if you know that your city is about to get invaded and conquered, you're going to be pretty upset, right? You're going to panic. You're going to run around shouting, no, don't let the Trojan horse in. And that's appropriate. That's how you should react, because it matters a lot. You should have emotions about things that matter a lot. And if everyone you know is about to get slaughtered by the Greeks, then that matters a lot. And you should be upset. Whereas her example is, well, if you're like a plant, if you're a spy for the Greeks, you're going to be very calm and controlled and present as very rational compared to the person who knows the invasion is happening and wants to warn everybody, right? So if that's the case, then emotions have some kind of place in moral judgments, moral statements, and moral discussion, because we think that sometimes the more emotional person is correct. Like if your city is being invaded, or if you left a church that was really bad for you, right? So it can't be that emotions are irrelevant to morality, says Mary Midgley. So both extremes must be mistaken. They've gone too far in one direction, right? This is the big argument she's making. So she puts it as saying you need a correct overall moral response, and that's made of two components. That's made of your judgment on the one hand, that something is right or wrong or whatever, and your emotional reaction on the other hand. And those two, in her terminology, those two complete each other. You don't have a complete healthy moral response with just one or the other. If you're upset for no reason, that's not right. And if you make a judgment, but it doesn't affect how you feel about things, that's not right either. You know, you've got to have both. So like if you're, if you had a really good friend who sold you out just for like $10, you shouldn't just think that's wrong. You should be upset, you know? You ought to be upset if somebody really cheats you like that, if someone's betrays you in that way. Otherwise, it's not healthy. It's not healthy not to feel about strong things like that. But then on the other hand, if you were just upset for no reason and taking it out on everybody, that wouldn't be good either. So you've got to have both together. You've got to have a good judgment and you've got to have the right emotional response. So it's about appropriateness of emotion, not about all emotion versus no emotion, right? So I bring that up for several reasons. I give you this reading partly so we don't get too caught up in things like, so we don't get distracted by what might seem like someone being angry or sad about some of these ethical things. Maybe they should be angry or sad about some of these ethical things. We don't want to sort of get distracted with, I don't know, does that mean we shouldn't listen to them? So I bring it up for that. That's going to help in the class. And I bring it up because emotions are going to keep coming up. So when we talk about Kant, a big part of it is going to be what he thinks about emotions. When we talk about virtue ethics and care ethics, they're going to have strong opinions about emotions. So it's good to sort of have this preliminary discussion about it before we get into the specific theories. So those are the main things from the Midgley reading. She talks about emotivism, which is the belief that moral beliefs are just expressions of feeling with no rational content. She talks about rationalism, which is the opposite, that emotion doesn't belong in morality. It's just a distraction. And then her own kind of intermediate position that you need a moral judgment and the appropriate emotional response if you're going to have a complete moral response, right? So those are some things to keep in mind when you discuss with the other people in your group, and it's something to keep in mind during the readings and your reflections on the readings.